Hello, I'm Robert, and voluntary fact checker and helping if you're scared of many things. And this is just to help you, this is the animation, and to help you to understand just how slowly these supposed Russian advances are. And I've talked about all the other stuff in my longer videos, so maybe I don't need to go over that again. So if you look at this, then just the thing to look at here, I'll go down to the separate videos here, separate pages here, and the blue here are regions that before the start of the animation, then Ukraine had already liberated that entire area in just a few days, and then these are two operations, one of a week or two, one of another over just a few days. And then that's when it starts. And from then on, if you go through the animation, and there'll be very, very small changes. That's the winter. You go to March, which is the winter of 2023, and at that time, Russia took Bakhmut, which I think is too small to see at this scale of map. And then over the summer, this dip is a little bit more noticeable, and that's the area where Ukraine got through the very dense, thick minefields, the unexpectedly thick minefields. Then they didn't have a failed counteroffensive, their counteroffensive simply never started. And so we haven't seen hundreds of tanks going on the front line in some big counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side, only on the Russian side. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive hasn't started yet. Then we have the over the winter, then Russia, unlike the situation 22 to 23, they didn't build any more defences as far as I can tell. Nobody's talking about them building any new fortifications, which should have been their priority. But they have Putin dismissed the general that was building those fortifications, and they seem to have this maximalist objective of saying we're going to go charging across Ukraine even though all the evidence is against this. And so they're not bothering very much about defence. But so this opportunity for counteroffensive is still there, it's just delayed. And they filled it in slightly, but the Ukraine is still across the front lines there, and in two places here, they're on the other side of the river. So they do have it all set up for counteroffensives. Then, just to give you a quick recap of what's happening in first of all, I explained in a longer video about how there's just a shortage of shells just now, but not nearly enough so that Russia will start charging across Ukraine. Czechia has found shells from outside the EU, which will fill the gap through to the end of this year and probably a bit next year as well. Meanwhile, NATO countries in Europe are hugely stepping up on their production of shells, with a big 31 projects in 15 different countries that to make these new shells. But it takes time to get all these things going, and they will make a big difference to ends of 2024 and going through to 2025 and 26. But there's this gap, and that's where Czechia is coming in. So then the big unknowns I talked about in a longer video, big unknown for the summer this year, if it's just NATO and if the United States funding doesn't come through, the big unknown is what difference will the F-16s make. I talked about how the Russians have 4,000 combat aircraft, and amongst that several hundred fighter jets. And Ukraine has only 50, and yet all the way through the war, the 50 or so MiG-29s, that's not the exact number, but it's around that, then they have managed to hold off the thousands of Russian combat aircraft, even though they are only able to use Russian fighter jets from when they left the Soviet Union, and they have no access to the later models since then. And yet they managed to, which are far improved from the MiG-29s. And yet Russia was only able to fly over outside of the occupied areas in the first few days to weeks of the war. Ever since then, even before they had air defences, the Patriot air defences, Ukraine kept them out. So what is going to happen when Ukraine has the F-16s, which are roughly equivalent to the modern fighter jets? So I explained that if they had the F-35s, then that would be the end of the war. It would only last a few hours. They'd have the entire airspace would be taken over by the F-35s. But Ukraine won't have those. And then Russia would just have to retreat because it's got nothing that can fight the F-35s. But with the F-16s, they're not going to be able to do that. But they will have a distinct edge because they have much better pilots and roughly equivalent fighter jets. So what are they going to do? And probably it'll certainly should make a big difference with any counter-offensives, and probably with mine clearing as well, some protection from above. So we'll see what happens. Then there's the very big unknown, as explained in the longer video, the very big unknown of the drones and the million drones, which Ukraine is much more. It's got lots of entrepreneurs who are testing these against the front line over and over and over and cycling around. And Russia doesn't have that dynamic. It does them top down. It says, look, this factory, you've got to make all this. And they just make 200 drones and send them to the front line. They don't have the kind of letting the little guys play around with ideas that Ukraine has. Which is likely to give Ukraine an edge, but how much an edge will it give? We've never had a war fought with drones in this way. To some extent last year, but this will be a very novel kind of war this year. So it's impossible to know if they will be able to do big counteroffensives with the the Europe behind them. And then it depends also on what Europe gives them, because there's lots of equipment that they haven't given them that they could, like for instance the Taurus missiles from Germany. But then what happens if the bill does come through in Congress? In that case, I think there's a good chance that Ukraine does do its long postponed counteroffensives. And the bill does look as if it might come through. So Mike Johnson said that he's going to bring it back to the floor on the very first day after their recess. So it looks as if he's trying to avoid having to argue with the far right and just say, look, here's the bill, you've got to vote. I'm not going to listen to you, just go and vote. And the thing is that Mike Johnson doesn't really care about the Ukraine bill himself, but he will not be able to stay as Speaker if he doesn't let the moderates, Republicans in the House, have their way with the funding for Ukraine. So he has a very strong incentive to find a way to make it happen. Otherwise he's likely to be thrown out as Speaker. So that's his point of view. And it looks as if he's going to give it a good go when they come back from the recess. So we'll see what happens. We'll know pretty quickly after the recess. Do they pass in the first few days, or do they not? And if they do, then that's it decided. If they don't, then it's probably lost its best chance, as it were. So we'll see what happens, and that'll be sometime in April. And there'll probably some arguing back and forth, and they might try some other method after that if they don't succeed in that way. Anyway, so we'll just find out what happens there. But the main thing is there's absolutely no risk of I hope you can see from all this background, there's no risk of Russia take over large areas of Ukraine, and no way that Russia is going to attack NATO. So I go back to Admiral Radakin. So people say to me, well, why isn't anyone else saying what you're saying? Well, the reason is that nowadays, just right now, there's an awful lot of spin. Even the Institute of Study of War, I talked about spin there, and there's spin in lots of the strategy. People who were just giving neutral, pretty careful, well-informed advice on strategy over 2020 through 2023. They're now, you can't really, they're not really saying things properly. They're obviously full of spin. You You can tell that because of the things they leave out when they're talking. So they used to just present both sides very clearly and present this is Russia's weaknesses, these are Ukraine's weaknesses, this is Russia's strengths, Ukraine's strengths, and this is what Ukraine's possibilities are. But now they just say, look, this is Russia's going to come charging across Ukraine. We're not going to explain why. We're not going to bother to explain to you why, and we're not going to tell you anything about how well about what NATO is doing to stop it. And so you look at that and you say that's spin, because you know what they've left out, and you know what they're not telling you. So nearly all the articles I see nowadays are spin, because they just leave stuff out. And they don't tell you things that would completely change the picture. Whereas in 2023 and winter 22-23, there wasn't all this spin. They were just telling you things that matched what you knew from the details. So the big picture they give no longer matches the details. That's what's so strange right now. They give this big picture idea which is all spin, and then they give the details which are accurate. And the two don't match, they don't fit each other. So it's very hard to find people who are giving you the proper good big picture. And so I'm presenting this without that spin between the details and the big picture. And I'm doing this because I don't have anyone I'm trying to persuade. I'm not trying to persuade Congress. I'm not trying to persuade NATO to increase its support for Ukraine. I'm not trying to intimidate Putin or anything like that. My only objective is to, or I'm not trying to make Putin overconfident, which I think is what Ukraine is doing. I think Ukraine is trying to, is really likes the way that Putin is kind of rushing, thinking, well, I don't need to defend myself because Russia is about to go charging across Ukraine. He might even believe that to some extent, but it's obvious he isn't. But he doesn't really think like a general, and so he's not really focusing on defending defending against counteroffensive, and I think at least part of that is that suits the Ukraine just fine, and they want to encourage Russia to think like that. I think that's at least part of it. Anyway, whatever the motivation for all this spin that I'm seeing everywhere, my own motivation is just to help people who are scared. And there's no risk of a world war. There's no risk of Russia attacking NATO. There's no risk of Russia charging through Ukraine. And that is why I've done this video. That's why I do the blog post. The only reason is to help the scared people to come for help in our group in Doomsday Debunked. And no matter where you are, no matter what your background, and even if you're very strongly pro-Russian, I'm just presenting things as they are. Or even if you are, or if you're from places like from China or India or somewhere, I'm not trying to persuade you to change your views. I'm just trying to help you because we keep getting asked by people who are scared that there's going to be a world war. There isn't. And people are scared that Russia's going to fight NATO. It isn't. So it's really hard. So I present this as being very favourable for Ukraine because that is how I assess the situation. Based on the details, it looks like Ukraine is winning. And I know it doesn't seem like that in the media, but if you go and look at it on the ground, that is what seems to be going on. Under the hood. Everyone knows about how they won back the Black Sea and the grain corridor, but they don't really think through the implications of what that means. That a country without a navy has managed to push the Black Sea fleet to the eastern edge of the Black Sea, and they're now going back to trade as normal through the Black Sea against the country that has one of the largest fleets in the world of warships. And why is that not an extraordinary thing? Why aren't people just marvelling at that and thinking, well, how extraordinary that is? And then the way that a country with only 50 fighter jets and a Patriot air defence system has now got Russia scared to bring its airborne command vessels, ships over the Azov Sea, and keeping their fighter jets way back from the front line. Or when they do come close, they tend to get shot down. So how is that not getting? Why are people not people know these things, and yet they don't draw out the implications and don't realise, what an extraordinary thing this is, how Ukraine is clearly winning with greatly less by way of numbers of planes and amounts of equipment, but they're using it skillfully. And so that's why, as I see it, Ukraine is winning. It's not Russia is winning. So now, if we go and look at what Admiral Ratakin says, so I'll give you some background, so hopefully you now will see it. So Admiral Ratakin says that we're not about to invade, Britain is safe, and he doesn't want a conflict with NATO because Russia will lose and lose quickly. And I hope you can see that, if this was a war with NATO, then the F-35s would have taken over all the occupied airspace of all the occupied area in the first few hours of the war, and we would never have invaded. And if at any point the F-35s, if NATO was to just suddenly say, oh, we don't care about, we're just going to send all our F-35, a few dozen F-35 pilots to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians, and then it's highly unlikely that Russia would shoot down any of those F-35s, and they would have control of the Russian airspace airspace over occupied Ukraine, and by the end of the day, they're that much better. But NATO is not going to do that because they just don't want to. They see that as possible. They just don't want to get involved directly involved in that way. But you can see that therefore Russia doesn't want to fight NATO, and it doesn't want NATO to get involved in Ukraine, and NATO doesn't want to get involved in Ukraine, and Zelensky doesn't want NATO in Ukraine either. And so he remarks about how it's remarkable that the way as Ukraine has without a navy has sunk a quarter of the Black Sea Fleet already. And Ukraine is in this war. It's like imagine Ukraine's like a NATO country because it's got quite a lot of NATO equipment, but they've got their hands tied behind their backs, and they have to try to fight without using their hands, because the NATO equipment comes with lots of restrictions. They can't use it most of it in Russian territory. Most of it comes with this thing saying you've got to stop at the edge of the Ukrainian former border. If they were a NATO country, they would be targeting, sending and they would have the Tomahawk cruise missiles. They would be hitting targets deep within Russia. They would be destroying the factories that make the missiles that Russia fires at Ukraine, for instance. And Russia wouldn't be able to stop that. So then it would be very difficult for Russia to make missiles to fire at Ukraine if it was a NATO country. And but Ukraine can't do that. It has to use its own drones, which are much less capable. And if it was a NATO country, the entire Black Sea Fleet would have been sunk long ago. But NATO is not going to give the equipment to Ukraine that would allow it to do that. So Ukraine is like and then the F-35 is already explained. So Ukraine is like a NATO country, but fighting with its hands tied behind its back. So this is why there is no way. That's why Putin is not going to fight NATO. It's lose quickly, and it's also far less capable than they thought before its disastrous illegal invasion. And then here's a diplomat, Josep Borrell, saying the same thing. Don't fight people unnecessarily. War is not imminent. What's imminent is the need for support for Ukraine. And I just want to remind you, when you look at this map, then I follow people in Ukraine to get an idea of what the ordinary Ukrainian life is like. So some of them, like a photographer that I follow, who takes photographs of normal Ukrainian life, and away from the front line, you wouldn't know that the war was going on. So it's really close to the front line that it is really hazardous. Now, of course, sometimes they have these attacks, very rarely, but for instance, Kiev especially is very well protected. It's only very rare that anything comes through. And remember, there's a very big city, and although some civilians have been killed there, your risk is far less than your risk of dying of a traffic accident in Kiev. So we shouldn't kind of over stress what it's like for ordinary civilians in Ukraine. It's a very difficult time for them, but the very difficult, the regions where there's all the shelling and where it's really hard to live and very hard for the people who live there, are the ones very close to the front line. Rest is pretty much like peacetime, of course, with a war, not exactly, and lots of these young men away in the fighting, but that's life is going on as usual. And then if you go to the rest of Europe, then we're not at war. We're simply not. We're not in any war with Russia. All we're doing is supplying equipment to Ukraine. None of the NATO soldiers is fighting with anyone. They're just doing exercises and supplying equipment to Ukraine. And they're not going to fight with Russia because, as you can see, Russia is not going to attack NATO. So hopefully this now and then, if you look at this and just watch this cycle through a few times and gradually let it kind of sink in, and hopefully eventually you can realise that there's nothing to worry about here at all. I have never for a moment worried about Russia attacking NATO. It's been absolutely obvious it's never going to do that. So hopefully this helps. It helps some of you to be less scared. I've already talked about nukes numerous times. Hopefully most of my readers know that Russia, its nukes are very useful as a bodyguard. So it's like a bodyguard that that if NATO was to try invading Ukraine, invading Russia, then Russia will say back to NATO, don't do that, we'll use our nukes, and then Russia and NATO would stop, because they don't want, the nuke is then a deterrent to stop NATO from invading Russia, not that it has any plans to do that. But if Russia uses a nuke, then that's a very different situation. Then NATO's priority is no longer deterrent. It's lost its deterrent if it uses just one nuke against NATO, because it can no longer say, now don't invade us, because if you do, we'll use nukes. So then NATO's priority would be, and it would very quickly take over the Russian airspace, and it would be able to, the Russian air defences would be useless, and their aim would be to stop Russia from firing nukes at any more nukes. And that's the only thing they can do. If Russia starts using them in an offensive way, then NATO then, and it wouldn't use nukes back. We now know, it's pretty clear, especially against this incredibly feeble, weak Russia we have now. There's no way it would respond to nukes with nukes, and it would probably use other methods as well, like hacking and people behind the front line and so on. And if Russia uses even just one small tactical nuke in Ukraine, then China and India would immediately consider Russia to be a rogue nation they don't want anything to do with. China cares much more about trade with the United States than about trade with Russia, which is really quite small for China, the amount of trade it does with Russia. They've never been close allies. There is a big disputed region that where it belongs to Russia that China thinks belongs to China, for instance. And they're not best pals. And so if the Russia used a single nuke in Ukraine, then this kind of arrangements of convenience, that they're kind of commercial and some political shared interests, would immediately disappear, and China and India would no longer want to be associated with Russia. And then we also know that if Russia used a single nuke against Ukraine, then the United States has told Russia what would happen next, so Putin wouldn't be surprised. And it probably involves Well, General Petraeus said that it likely involves targets in the Black Sea. He doesn't know, but he's guessing as some of the kind of good inside information, but not know what was actually said to Russia. Then he says that it could involve targets throughout the occupied Ukraine and in the Black Sea. Well, something that the United States could do, they could either use their Tomahawk cruise missiles or the F-35s for that matter to sink the entire Black Sea fleet. They could do Tomahawk cruise missiles from great distance, just with conventional explosives, a neat little explosive in each one, upgrading the warships, as they put in inverted commas, ironically, satire, to a sub at the bottom of the sea, in other words, sink them. And they would just quietly, with no fuss, start to sink. And that would probably be the end of Putin's regime, if that happened. And then, if the United States felt that was too provocative to do it themselves, they could just say, well, they could just send a few hundred Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine and say, look, here you are, Ukraine, you have our permission because of the nuke that Russia dropped on Ukraine. You now have our permission to sink the Black Sea Fleet. So that would be another way that the United States could do it, which would be just as humiliating for Russia. And then that would be the end of the Black Sea Fleet, because we now know that Russia's air defences can't stop it, can't stop the NATO weapons. And so the very last thing that Putin wants is to use even a single nuke against Ukraine. It would be the end of. He'd lose the war very quickly after that. So there's no way that Putin's going to use nukes, and they wouldn't help him at all, and he can't win with them. And so there's never been a risk of that either. So hopefully this helps you to be a little bit less scared about all this and just and hopefully see it like this is how I've seen it all the way through the war. I'm maybe getting a bit better at explaining it, and hopefully you can understand a bit better why I've never thought there was any risk of Russia attacking NATO. It was very, very obvious. It has been all the way through. So anyway, hopefully that helps some of you who've been scared.